Thank you very much, Luca. Thank you very much to Leo for inviting me here and to be able to speak in my hometown, which is always a great pleasure. So I just want to bring this debate to the concrete experience at the European Commission very much in the last few months or so, and I'll show you quite intense merger activity over the last 9 months. And I want to comment a bit also on what Leslie and Joe have said. In particular, Leslie has recommended more of a focus on explicit coordination. So one end of the spectrum, Joe is encouraging us to look at the other end of the spectrum as well. Forms of coordination which may not fall under the classic category of dynamic repeated games as game theory would identify them. And I think we are somewhat in the middle in our practical experience, but probably closer to Leslie than to Joe, and I'll just try to explain why that's the case. So let me just start with very much an overview of what's been going on in terms of European Commission enforcement of mergers in the last 9 months. And these are the 8 cases that have been decided since September 2012. So you can see these are, just the phase 2 cases, which are the most intense and complex cases. You can see we've been fairly busy and we're all quite exhausted as a result. And what I've put here is the case, the date of decision, and then the outcome and the theory of harm that was pursued in these cases, in the ones where an intervention was made. And UE means unilateral effects. So, as you may gather from the slides, we don't have any cases of enforcement with coordinated effects, which makes you wonder why I'm on the panel. But let me try to explain what I think we can still draw some useful lessons from the absence of enforcement, and also a couple of cases which are on the list, in particular the M-Commerce case, where coordinated effects were looked at very closely, in part in the spirit of what Leslie was pointing at a framework that can analyze deviations both in a unilateral and coordinated sense. And then the other case that I would like to discuss very briefly in this regard is Hutchinson-Orange. So before doing that, let me just spend a few words on why I think this is the case, that we are running more enforcement on unilateral effects. And I don't think the reason is the one that Luca has highlighted initially, that we have these fancy tools that we want to play with, and therefore on unilateral, and then allow us to build a stronger quantitative analysis of merger effects. I think that the reasons for why coordinated effects are harder to show to the required standard of proof are more fundamental than that. So just 3 points I want to make on this. The first, that, as most of you will know, economic theory gives you quite an ambiguous prediction on unilateral effects. It tells you that a higher degree of concentration will tend to increase prices in a unilateral sense. So absent strong efficiencies or very distant competitors, those price effects may be significant. And therefore, the direction of change on prices from unilateral is unambiguous, which makes it easier, therefore, to run an argument where concerns are raised, whilst we know that on coordinated effects, economic theory not only identifies several potential equilibrium, but also tells you that a merger concentration may not actually make coordination easier. I guess the easiest example of that, and the one that people know, is the one where higher concentration is associated with greater asymmetry in an industry, and we know from coordinated effects theory that tends to make coordination more difficult, not more likely. So that's one reason why, in terms of economics, we tend to, it's more likely than not that we would find unilateral concerns more than coordinated concerns. The second reason is that coordinated effects may arise in 2 forms. One is based on a concern that the merger may create the conditions for coordinated pricing. So therefore, you change the type of equilibrium firms are playing from one where they're playing, and I think here the standard toolkit is useful in the sense that they're going from a game where they're playing a static or perhaps more static relationship to one that's more dynamic and more based on a systems of punishments, of potential deviations from coordination. This is really premised on quite a drastic change in competitive conduct compared to what you observed pre-merger. And therefore, establishing that that change will occur in a forward-looking way is clearly harder than compared to unilateral effects. The change is more incremental. It's the same game that people are playing, the firms are playing, and it's just that the concentration leads to a less intense competition. So in this particular case of creation of conditions for coordination, it is pretty much a regime shift that you're envisaging, and that's harder to project on a forward-looking basis. The second category of coordinated effects, and the one that we tend to focus more in practice, and I'll mention a few examples, is the one based on strengthening the conditions for coordination that may exist prior to the merger. And that strengthening will come about from the reallocation of assets that the merger brings about, and the several reasons why that could increase or make coordination more sustainable. Now, I think that the main challenge there, and this goes back to what Leslie was saying as well, is that if there's no clear evidence of explicit coordination prior to the transaction, then you have to be able to build this story on the fact that firms are tacitly coordinating prior to the merger, and distinguishing a tight oligopoly outcome from tacit coordination is notoriously difficult and may be hard to prove to the required standard of proof within, again, the constraints of a merger investigation. If, on the other hand, explicit coordination can be shown, or there is sufficient evidence that that could be the case prior to the merger, then I think this type of mechanism is easier to demonstrate, and therefore it's probably one of the most promising type of cases for coordinated effects. Before moving to some cases I want to discuss, let me also briefly point you back to this list and the type of unilateral effects cases we've run, just to go back to some of Joe's remarks. I mean, some of these cases, in particular the last three, Ryanair, Aer Lingus, Munzio, Alstom, and Cinemas Mac, were effectively mergers to monopoly, at least in some of the affected markets, and therefore there was nobody to coordinate with post-merger. In that sense, it's obvious that that type of theory was not run. However, I would say that in some other cases, I'm thinking in particular of Outokumpu Inoxum, UPS TNT, Munzio, Alstom in part, the behavior of parties outside the merger was a key consideration in our assessment. And in particular, whether those firms how they would react to the merger was an integral part of the concerns, and we relied on standard oligopoly theory, again, I think static theory, to suggest that the reaction by those firms would not eliminate the price increase from the merger, and those firms would actually accommodate the price increase in the logic of standard oligopoly theory, for example, was known as strategic complementarity, and more generally, for example, in Outokumpu Inoxum, on the basis of a static model of price competition with capacity constraints. So I think one can capture important oligopoly dynamics within the framework of unilateral effects. Now then, let me turn to the best case over this period for coordinated effects that we have not run. That's because it's a case not on that list. This is a case that will be close to many people probably in the room, and many people will know it. And it's a case in Italy, Tirrenia, on the Italian ferries market, in particular involving Sardinia. And the Italian authority has published just a few days ago a cartel decision against some of the firms involved in this transaction, finding that over the past 2 years or so, there was a cartel vis-à-vis on ferries prices on Sardinian routes. Now, this case was notified in its initial form to the European Commission, and a phase 2 was started in January 2012. However, the transaction was withdrawn a few months later once it was the phase 2 was in the middle of the investigation. Now, in this case, we had two of the main incumbents on routes to Sardinia, Mobi and GMV, each acquiring a third of Tirrenia. another player on the routes affected under public ownership, and as I'll show you, with quite different conduct prior to the transaction. And if you looked at the routes affected, these are the three main routes to Sardinia from the mainland Italy that were the focus of our concerns, at least. Then you can see that the two acquiring parties, each with a third of Tirrenia, and Tirrenia, the target, accounted for the vast majority of passengers on this route. So we're talking about post-merger shares of the partners and the target of around 90%. So one could think of running this case as unilateral effects. In particular, you would apply the standard literature on minority stakeholding that was discussed in the morning here, and how an acquiring firm with a large stake in a competing firm would change its pricing behavior, and also how they could exercise control over that acquiring firm in order to reduce competition. However, this would still not be a classic merger to monopoly situation, despite the high combined shares I've shown you, precisely because it's not a full acquisition, and in particular, a partial stake is held by several partners. The other feature, I think, and a challenge for unilateral effects in this case is one of the partners in the transaction was not present on Sardinian routes, so they would not have an incentive to accommodate or to reduce the competitive pressure exercised by the target Tirrenia to the benefit of the other two partners in the transaction. So whilst one could be concerned by the unilateral effects, I think that this particular case was much more suitable for a coordinated effects concern. In particular, of course, at the time of the investigation, the Commission knew that the cartel investigation had started by the authority back in May 2011. The evidence was that there was a sudden and very sharp increase in fares for Sardinia for summer 2011, and that increase was implemented very close afterwards the formation of CIN, the joint venture vehicle for the acquisition of Tirrenia. And the evidence that now the authority has put forward in its decision on the cartel was that the price increases by the acquiring parties were very high, well above the level that would be justified by simply the increase in fuel cost that was experienced over this period, was also above the non-Sardinian benchmarks for the parties. In particular, GMV had routes to Sicily that didn't experience such a large price impact as the Sardinian routes. Moreover, Tirrenia's behavior was quite different than the one from the acquiring parties. Its price increases on the routes were much more in line with the cost increase. Finally, as part of the investigation, the Commission had access to the documentary evidence that the authority in Italy was using on the cartel investigation, so the documentary evidence on contacts between the parties, on contractual links between the parties, in particular revenue sharing, close revenue sharing on some of the routes of concern, and on extensive monitoring of rivals' fares. So all of this probably made it a textbook case for coordinated effects, and I think one that would have relied very much on an ongoing investigation of an explicit cartel, one that on an ex post has resulted in a decision of that kind, but that at the time would have been, at the time, obviously, of the merger investigation, that was unknown, but I think they would have led to justifiable concerns for coordinated effects. But that was the case that we did not have because it was withdrawn, as I mentioned. So we cannot use it for the future as a potential benchmark case. Let me then spend a few words on Hutchinson Orange, another complex case, one where I think the Commission, for example, in the opening of the phase 2, the in-depth investigation, also considered coordinated effects and gave careful thought to the possibility of coordinated effects arising from the transaction. This is a case in Austria, in the mobile market in Austria, a 4-to-3 merger involving the two smallest players in the Austrian mobile market, with a combined share of the stock of postpaid subscribers in Austria of around a quarter of the market. Now, as you'll see in the decision, I think this decision is public or will be public quite soon. The parties had quite a high share, in spite of a relatively low share of the stock of subscribers, had a quite high share of new contracts, so new subscribers, they were switching between the rival firms. The diversion ratios that could be computed on the basis of portability analysis that's readily available in these markets suggested a much more symmetric market structure across the 4 operators than the share of the stock of subscribers was indicating. If you couple that with the presence of fairly high variable margins in a network industry like the mobile market, then you can see how a UPP-style exercise that was commented on earlier in the afternoon would lead you to fairly significant price effects. This was one of the first time the Commission used UPP in practice as a ground for enforcement, and therefore was quite a novel case in that sense. Moreover, it was coupled with the fact that the 2 parties were not the largest players in the industry, and therefore was a complex case to bring forward in order for the parties to put forward remedies that would alleviate the concerns. Now, the remedies then allow for both for new entry in the market. However, as I mentioned, the Commission did consider coordinated effects quite closely. It's well known, I think, in the industry that mobile markets may be prone or vulnerable to coordination, either tacit or explicit. Some well-known features, in particular, I think that are worth stressing, are the absolute barriers to entry from spectrum requirements and a very disaggregated buyer side. Pricing is complex in this industry. There's many tariffs. On the other hand, these are retail prices that can be observed by rival firms, and there may be scope for coordination on some elements of pricing or potentially on market shares, as national competition authorities had looked at in the past. There had been past decisions by the national authorities in this industry, which were, however, quite old at the time of this merger, and there were ongoing investigations whose result was not known at the time of this transaction. Moreover, again, in terms of supporting a coordinated effects concern, there was evidence that Hutchinson has a maverick-type feature in the market. In particular, was quite fairly aggressive price competitor in the market. On the other hand, they were not the target of the acquisition. They were the acquiring party. It's not clear to what extent its behavior would have changed post-merger, in addition to the unilateral effects that the UPP-type analysis was capturing already. Ultimately, the Commission only ran unilateral effects in this case, did not combine it with coordinated effects. It felt that the evidence, overall evidence, on the Austrian market in particular, and coupled with some of the benchmark examples from other countries, wasn't to the required standard of proof for coordinated effects. On the other hand, it's also true that the type of commitments that would have alleviated the concerns on unilateral effects also address, to a large extent, the risk of coordination post-merger. So this is an example, I think, of the difficulties I mentioned earlier for coordinated effects, but it's not to say that the Commission did not think hard about this type of effects in this particular industry and was discouraged by the jurisprudence in this regard. Let me just spend a few words on m-commerce just to encourage you to read the decision, in the sense that this is a decision that went to phase 2, but where the clearance was unconditional. This is about a joint venture of the 3 main mobile operators in the UK in connection with the sale of mobile wallet services via what's called NFC, near-field communication technology. Here, the Commission considered in detail the risk of foreclosure of rival mobile wallet services, both in terms of unilateral effects and in terms of coordinated effects. And what Leslie said before about having a framework that looks at potential deviations for particular players from a given equilibrium resonates here, because we use the same framework both to look at unilateral deviations from a joint foreclosure outcome and also at coordinated deviations, or rather a story about where the deviations would be deterred over time by a system of punishments, and found that under both counts the deviation gains were too large to sustain both unilateral and coordinated effects. Again, a case where The concern was looked at in quite some detail, but ultimately was found that the standard of proof was not met for concerns. Let me just simply conclude, by highlighting the main message that I wanted to convey, in particular that I think there's a good reasons in terms of economic theory for why the evidentiary standard on coordinated effects remains high, in particular higher than for unilateral effects. I would say that the Tirrenia example teaches us that the most promising cases will typically include clear evidence of sparse coordination, which may well be explicit coordination, and ideally in the same market, so in the same market where the investigation is occurring, so that it's easier in terms of the procedure and the timing constraint to collect the appropriate evidence. Let me conclude here. Thank you very much.